Noah nodded politely, turned, and left. The door clicked, soft open, soft close. The moment he left, Angie, lying on the sickbed, opened her eyes. A thin, ridiculing smile flickered there. Mom, why is it that when a relationship is over, a man can turn around without delay while a woman can't? Did he love me? Why am I the only one who's lonely right now? Silly girl, don't think too much. If he didn't love you, he wouldn't have come to your side, no matter what happens to you. Mom, no matter the price, I have to go back to Noah. I have to go back to him. When Noah drove back to the villa, the huge house had sunk into a deathly silence. He searched the dozen rooms, upstairs and down, but found no one. Panic rose, sharp and sudden. He found Maeve on the roof, perched on the fence with her feet in the air. The morning sun washed her back in red gold, but it couldn't warm the desolation there. Noah's heart nodded. He held his breath, moved slowly, and wrapped his arms around her from behind. He pulled her close, as if he held his whole world. Maeve, why are you sitting here? His voice trembled, his heart pounding hard enough to hurt. She had really scared him. Maeve said nothing. She tipped her chin up, eyes narrowed at the horizon. Her body was cold as ice. It was impossible to know how long she'd been there. About his absence last night, she didn't ask. She turned to him with the same indifferent calm as always. More than once, Noah had wished she would quarrel with him, anything to prove she still cared. But he knew that if she made a scene, she wouldn't be Maeve Foster Anderson. Maeve. His lips brushed her ear, his chest tight to her back, and still he couldn't warm her. Her lashes lowered, then lifted. Focus returned to her glazed eyes, the corner of her mouth tilted with a faint, mocking curve. 6 years ago, I stood at the edge of the 26th floor with my grandmother's ashes. Alex carried me down from there. You miss him? So asked, too casual to be casual. Maybe. Maeve's voice stayed light. She had coveted that brief warmth in Alex's arms. She'd thought it was love. Noah didn't buy it. When someone is lost and drowning, the first hand that offers warmth feels like a lifeline. Gratitude can look a lot like love. Maeve, love moves you. Put a hand to your heart. Has it ever raced for Alex? I don't need you to teach me what love is, Noah. She twisted to face him, control slipping. Noah Anderson, what right did he have to question her love? He didn't deserve the word. Moved? Of course she'd been moved, when he knelt and begged her to marry him, when he stood in the rain and swore she could believe him, when he held her and promised he would always guard her. And then, just like that, he turned away with iron resolve. Yes, she hadn't slept. She'd heard him whisper Angie's name on the phone. He hadn't come home all night. She'd sat on the roof waiting for him, hours cooling to ash until even her hope lost its heat. When she climbed down from the sky platform's fence, both legs had gone numb. She staggered, nearly falling. Careful. Noah swept her up and strode back from the balcony. Maeve didn't struggle. She let her head rest against his chest, eyes beautiful and empty. Noah, 3 years ago I could have let go of Alex. I could have let go of you too, she thought. In this marriage, she had kept stepping back, retreat after retreat. Now she'd reached the last line. One more step and there'd be no way back. Noah stopped mid-step. He looked down at her, eyes dark with a sadness she couldn't read. He carried her to the bedroom and turned the thermostat to its highest setting. Warmth crept back into her limbs, but her head stayed heavy with fog. She forced herself up, morning light still angled through the curtains. Before he could even think about breakfast, she changed into fresh clothes and headed for the door. Where to? Noah blocked her, worry roughening his tone. You were drenched yesterday and didn't rest. Take a day. No need. I'm not that delicate. Her tone was cool. She did feel unwell, but she'd rather breathe hospital disinfectant than sit in this empty house and let her thoughts run wild. I'll take you. Noah snatched the keys from the tea table and hurried after her. No, thank you. The politeness in her voice felt like a wall between strangers. At her stubbornness, Noah could only sigh. He pressed a key fob into her palm, patient. Your car's still at the 4S store for repairs. I brought you a new one. See if you like it. Noah's garage held a dozen high-end cars, all makes and models. Even so, the brand-new BMW Z4 stood out, sleek and bright in front of the garage. Any other woman might have squealed. Maeve simply opened the door, started the engine, and drove off, expression unchanged. She parked in the underground lot. As she stepped out, heels tapping, she ran into Dina coming in for work. Dina's gaze flicked to the new car, and she grinned. Wow, Madam Anderson, you brought the little roadster today. Is this the rich lady life for real? Congrats on getting back on track. What kind of life is the rich lady life? Maeve asked, unhurried, walking toward the elevator. Dina held up two fingers. Two things. 1. Spend money to make yourself happy. 2. Make men happy in bed. Simple, comfortable. No worries about the bills. Sounds nice, but it's not the life I want. Because to Maeve, there was no difference between that and a life sold by the hour. The elevator chimed and slid open onto the 12th floor maternity ward. Antiseptic hung faintly in the air. Maeve slipped into her white coat and started her rounds, heels soft against the linoleum. As she passed Willa's door, a crash split the quiet. When will I be able to leave the hospital? How long do you want me to stay in this damned place? Miss Foster, you'll need to be observed for a few more days before you can be discharged, the head nurse said, voice steady. How much longer? Can you return my child, or can you make my womb grow back? Porcelain shattered again. Maeve exhaled, helpless, then pushed the door open and stepped inside. Sis, please, we have to face reality. The baby is gone, but you still have one fallopian tube and part of your uterus. With IVF, you still have a chance to be a mother. It's all bullshit. I don't want to hear it. You shameless devil, scram. I don't want to see you. Maeve pressed her lips together, color draining until they turned almost transparent. She turned to the head nurse. How is my sister's recovery? Her blood pressure and temperature, are they stable? Maeve the devil, you don't need to ask. Get lost. Willa's voice pitched higher. She grabbed the metal kettle from the bedside table and hurled it. Maeve moved fast. The kettle clanged against the wall, water fanning out. Several hot drops splashed across Maeve's white coat, making her flinch. She looked even paler. Willa, even if I had to make the same choice again, I would still treat you. In that moment, I had to save your life first. Willa didn't hear a word. She lunged like a woman unmoored, striking and kicking. Maeve didn't raise a hand in return. Retreating, she misstepped. Her ankle twisted with a sharp pop and she went down hard into the corner. Dr. Foster, please step out first. I'll handle this, the head nurse said, guiding her toward the door, exasperation softening into concern. Maeve sank onto a bench in the corridor, jaw tight. She rubbed her ankle, angry, swelling, skin flushed a dark red. The ache throbbed up her calf. Her head swam, the fever still hadn't broken, heat licking under her skin. She sighed. Looked like she'd need to ask for leave, again. Maeve, what's wrong? The voice came from above, cool, threaded with something like sadness. She tipped her head up. Alex, of course. The corners of her mouth tilted in a small, self-mocking smile. Heaven had a sense of humor. He always found her at her worst. It's nothing. I just twisted my ankle, she said lightly. Alex glanced from her to Willa's door and put it together. Did she bully you again? I told you not to go in there, but you wouldn't listen. Maeve let out a thin laugh. Maybe she deserved it. What's the point of talking about it now? She's a patient. Take good care of her. Don't let her get cold. Try to calm her down. And... Maeve, you're still as kind as ever. His gaze gentled. His voice warmed, cautious, careful. Go in and check on her. She doesn't look good. Remember, she's your wife. Maeve pushed herself up. Pain ripped through her ankle the second she put weight on it, and she pitched forward. Ah! The cry tore out, but she didn't hit the floor. Alex's arm circled her waist, pulling her against him, holding her upright. The same broad chest, the faint, clean scent of soap. For a heartbeat, it felt like nothing had changed. But it had. Time had done its work. This man no longer lived in her heart. Be careful, he murmured, gentle reproach threaded with concern. I'm fine. Thank you. She drew back, cool now, set her palm to the wall, and hobbled forward with effort. Alex shook his head and stepped in again to steady her. Where to? I'll see you off. No need. If you don't want me to keep pestering you, don't be so stubborn, he cut in. She hesitated, then nodded. Help me to the main entrance. Because she couldn't put weight on her ankle, Alex slid an arm around her waist and guided her out of the hospital. On the steps, she lied, soft, practiced. Noah's coming to pick me up. After a bit of back and forth, he finally let her go. Maeve eased herself onto the stone steps, shrugged off her white coat, and set it beside her. She sat alone, a bitter, wry smile tugging at her mouth. What now? Drag this ruined ankle across the road and flag a taxi, probably. She braced a hand and pushed to stand. Worry pinched between her brows, then stilled. A Land Rover idled not far away. Flashy plates, the car of a cold, arrogant man. 100 meters away, Noah sat behind the wheel, shadow cutting across his face. His sword-straight brows drew low as he watched her, gaze frosted. He'd been worried enough to trail her all the way to the hospital. And what had he seen? Her in another man's arms. 3 years married to him. Did he think she still wanted to rekindle things with Alex? Maeve stood very still, knowing Noah's eyes were on her. Hope flickered anyway, small, stubborn. She waited for him to drive over, to open the door, to take her home. The car didn't move. She let out a breath and smiled, brittle at the edges. What was she waiting for? From beginning to end, she'd been indulging in her own one-sided love. Maeve dragged her twisted leg and limped to the passenger door. She pulled it open. Without waiting for her to settle, Noah hit the throttle. The car shot forward like an arrow. They drove in silence. Cold anger rolled off him, ice, sharp and unspoken. She could feel it, and she had no idea why. If anyone had the right to be angry, it should be her. The car slid into the manor and stopped before the villa. Neither of them moved. The silence stretched, thick, heavy, until it pressed on her lungs. Maeve broke first. The stifling air made her chest ache. She reached for the door, instinctive, but Noah was faster. The lock clicked. His hand clamped her wrist and he yanked her hard against his chest. What are you? His mouth crashed down, teeth cutting into her lower lip. Her fury flared. Hurt and grievance burned hot. She bit back, harder, meaner. Blood flooded her mouth, metallic and hot. She couldn't tell whose it was. His grip tilted her chin. He kept at it, merciless, teeth worrying her soft lips as their breathing turned ragged, louder, harsher. She fought, weakly, uselessly. Cold sweat beaded on her brow. Tears slipped free, silent, tracking to the corner of her mouth and making the blood taste even more bitter. Something pinched between Noah's brows. The pressure eased. He lingered against her, breath a rough drag, then muttered, low and dark, "Stay away from Alex. Don't force me to destroy him." A hard buzz roared in her skull. Her face drained of color. She shoved him away with everything she had and stared, eyes raw and freezing. Are you threatening me? Just a reminder, Noah said, indifferent. She laughed, sharp, broken. Tears slid again. Of course he was furious. He must have seen her with Alex at the hospital entrance. Then why didn't you stay away from Felice and Angie? He demanded loyalty. Did he ever think how filthy he was? Noah, don't make everyone live like you do. I don't two-time, ever. Even if you don't mind being dirty, I'm still disgusted. She tore his hand off her wrist, pushed the door open, and slammed it behind her. She lifted her chin, trying, foolishly, to smile. The tears wouldn't stop. Each step was a battle, her legs heavy as lead, her thoughts smudged, the world dimmed, then went black. Somewhere in the blur, a panic-stricken shout chased her down. Maeve! Maeve was out for a full day and night, burning with a 40 degrees fever. She lay quiet on the hospital bed, skin paper pale, breaths thin. An IV line ran cold along the back of her hand. Noah sat at her bedside and pulled the blanket higher around her shoulders. A knock sounded. Moments later, Dina slipped in with a bottle of medicine. She was a nurse. No surprise there. The surprise came behind her, Jake Foster. Dad, why are you here? Noah stood. Shock flickered in his eyes, then vanished. I heard Maeve is sick. Is it serious? Jake took the chair by the bed and handed his jacket to the secretary behind him. Maeve couldn't pretend to sleep any longer. She opened her eyes and shaped a weak smile. Dad, she rasped. Jake's answering smile was warm. He looked to Noah. Noah, I'll stay with Maeve. Governor Foster was clearly easing him out, shielding a father-daughter talk from him. Noah's face stayed calm. His smile stayed polite. I'll head back to the company. Please take care of my wife for me. The words had an edge. Maeve was his. Even with her father, he framed it as caretaking. He left. Dina raised the head of the bed. She helped Maeve sit up, and Maeve's face blanched completely. Because of Willa's matter, are you blaming your father? Jake's voice was thick and warm as always. No. Simple. Flat. Jake sighed. I asked my secretary to investigate. It was me. I was wrong about you. Maeve, you're a good, kind child. The faint curve at Maeve's lips faded, all color with it. Her father loved her, yes, but he was painfully rational. She looked down. The skin around the OV site was bruised and swollen. She slipped the needle out with practiced care and pressed 2 fingers to the bleeding spot. What's wrong? I'll call a doctor, Jake said, half rising. No need. Dad, did you forget I'm a doctor too? Maeve's tone was calm. Jake nodded and sat back, watching her. After a beat, Maeve, is this illness related to Noah? She paused, startled by the question. Then, after a moment, she shook her head. Just a fever from the rain. Dad, you're making a fuss over nothing. Another sigh. This time something raw threaded his words. He rarely showed worry, but she was his daughter. Her unhappiness wasn't invisible to him. Back then, you should never have agreed to marry Noah. He's someone you can't control. Dad, you know me. Whatever I do, right or wrong, I don't regret it. But Dad regrets it. Affection softened his face. He knew the rumors about Noah and that pianist. He had turned a blind eye. Noah was young and exceptional by birth and by talent. Jake had been pressured into agreeing to their marriage. Now he regretted it. Maeve, you're still young. You'd better not let yourself be wronged. Do you understand what I mean? Maeve nodded blankly, then shook her head. Of course she understood. Her father was hinting at divorce at Noah. A bitter laugh slipped out of her. Suddenly she felt lost. Was ending it the only way to finally be free? After Maeve left the hospital, she lay at home for an entire week before she allowed herself to go back to work. In the garage, she passed the BMW and chose the repaired Beetle. She snorted at herself. What a joke. So unlucky to be a rich woman. Maeve was on duty in gynecology. Most of her patients were expectant mothers. Their happy smiles warmed something inside her. If she couldn't be happy, then watching other people's happiness was its own kind of warmth. After she sent off a woman who was about to give birth, the nurse opened the door and called in the next patient. Please, take a seat. Maeve kept her eyes on the chart. She didn't look up, just heard the click of high heels and felt the light shift as someone stepped in and sat down. The color Doppler report shows nothing wrong with your body. Any discomfort? She skimmed the case report. When she finally lifted her gaze, surprise flickered through her eyes. Angie? She wore a long beige dress that skimmed her legs, silver heels catching the light. One knee crossed over the other, posture neat and elegant. We meet again, Mrs. Anderson. Angie's smile was provocative, her emphasis on the last words dripping with ridicule. Maeve leaned back against the chair. Her cold fingertips tightened around the pen. In the hospital, please call me Dr. Foster. Angie's smile didn't flicker. Of course. Miss Lopez, if there's nothing wrong with your body, please give the time to the next patient, Maeve said, voice steady, formal. Yes. Angie nodded, but her smile thinned into bitterness. I'm not uncomfortable. It's just my annual routine checkup. Usually, Noah comes with me every year. He had something on his plate today, so I came by myself. Maeve held her gaze and tucked the rest of her feelings away. Let her flaunt. She had nothing to say, and yet this was only the beginning. Angie idly twirled a strand of hair and set her pure white phone on the table. The screen flickered. Even from a glance, Maeve saw it clearly. Noah and Angie wrapped around each other, a picture-perfect couple. His smile was brilliant, almost blinding. He had never smiled at her like that. Apart from a few symbolic wedding photos, she and Noah had never even taken a picture together. Maybe this was the difference between love and being forced to love. Angie had shown it to her on purpose. The sudden ache in Maeve's chest made Angie's eyes gleam with satisfaction. Noah probably never told you I lost a child for him, Angie said quietly. I've never been in good shape since. He blames himself. It wasn't his fault. I didn't protect our child well enough. He loves me so much he put down the basketball he adores and drove me to piano lessons every day. We'd play duets, for hands, side by side. She smiled at the memory. When I was sad, he'd stand under my dorm all night with his guitar and sing. He loves to sing. Angie's voice blurred. Maeve shut it out. Her eyes burned, dry and hot. God, she wanted to cry, but pride would not let her do it here, not in front of Angie. If Miss Lopez came here today to speak to me about this, Maeve said at last, crisp and cool, then I'm sorry. I don't discuss personal matters during work hours. There are many patients waiting. Angie didn't move. She went on, unhurried. I don't know if Dr. Foster follows social media, but there was a post that went viral once. An 82-year-old scientist, Jeremy Wills, married Sarah Oman, who was 28. People accused him of being lustful and greedy. Then an old photo of Jeremy and Liana Kress surfaced, and everyone was shocked to see that Liana and Sarah looked very similar. She paused, then added, meaningful as a knife sliding in, green plums wither, bamboo horses age, and from now on, the people I love are all very similar to you. Maeve sat rigid, a frown tightening between her brows. If Angie hadn't said it, she might never have noticed. Their eyes were similar. Even their smiles, God, were similar. You finally see it. Angie lifted her chin, smug. You do look a bit like me. Now you understand. Noah married you and treated you well because you look like me. But so what? He doesn't love you. I'm back now. You should step aside. If you don't want to be a stand-in for the rest of your life, then divorce him. Silence fell, heavy and airless. Maeve stared at a single point on the desk. Face pale, expression unreadable. The steadiness made Angie, for the first time, a little uneasy. Then Maeve let out a soft laugh and set the pen down with a click. Miss Lopez, your story is very interesting. But what does it have to do with me? I'm not interested in other people's stories. She turned her head. Nurse, call the next patient in. This, Angie faltered, stunned. Maeve's reaction was nothing like she'd imagined. The door pushed open. A middle-aged woman bustled in, steering her daughter-in-law forward for a pregnancy check. Without a word, the woman nudged Angie out of the chair and helped her daughter-in-law sit down. "What are you doing? Do you have any manners?" Angie staggered 2 steps, almost losing her balance. "Weren't you sick? What are you still doing here?" The woman didn't even flinch. "What are you arguing about? This is a hospital. If you're not here to see a doctor, then leave." The nurse raised her voice, a sharp bark that cut through the corridor. The lady fell silent. Angie huffed, chin tipped up. She turned to go, tossing over her shoulder, "Maeve, you really know how to deceive yourself." After Angie left, the woman spread a sheet on the desk, impatient. "This is the new B-mode ultrasound report. Doctor, do you think it's a boy or a girl?" Maeve lowered her head. The words on the page blurred. A single tear slipped free. She wiped it away quickly and forced her voice steady as she continued the exam, as if nothing had happened. By the end of clinic, Maeve felt wrung out. She stood alone at the corridor window, a small, self-mocking smile tugging at her lips. She hadn't known she could be this calm, this rational. Her heart pounded like it might burst, yet her hands had remained steady, her voice level, treating patients as if nothing at all had broken inside her. "Maeve? Why are you standing here?" A low, deep male voice came from behind. She turned. At some point, Alex had already walked up. Maeve gave him a warm, casual smile. "It's almost time to get off work. I'm just grabbing a breath. Is Willa still not discharged?" "I just finished the paperwork. She'll go home tomorrow morning." Alex stepped in front of her, steadying her face. His brows drew together. "Maeve, you don't look well. Are you feeling okay?" She didn't answer. She only shook her head slowly. A draft slipped through the window, lifting the hair at her forehead. Almost without thinking, Alex reached out, fingertips aiming for a stray strand. He leaned away from his touch. At that exact moment, Willa stepped from the ward and saw it. She launched forward, voice breaking into a hysterical scream. "Maeve, you vixen, have you no shame?" A sharp crack split the hall as Willa's palm struck. Maeve's cheek flamed. She pressed a hand to it, then lifted her gaze, cold and steady. "Willa, you shouldn't be discharged. You'd better go check in with psychiatry." In her eyes, Willa was a mad dog now, ready to lunge and bite at any opening. There was no reason to stand here and be a spectacle. Maeve turned and walked away, ignoring the roar that followed her down the corridor. "Maeve, you just have a guilty conscience. Seducing another woman's husband. Despicable. Disgusting." "Have you messed around enough? Isn't that disgraceful enough?" Alex cut in, dragging Willa back into the room. Maeve drove her Beetle, circling the vast city twice, as if the streets would never end. A hollow, unfamiliar confusion spread through her. On the east side, her father's government compound. On the west, Noah's villa, and yet none of it belonged to her. She could only stand at the edge of happiness. Warmth was a shore she could see, but could never reach. She finally took the coastal road. The ocean under the night was bottomless, a dark expanse. Heavy waves rolled and crashed as if they might swallow a life at any moment. On the rocky shore alone, she set a handful of white chrysanthemums at her feet. She stared at the seam where sky met sea. This was where her grandmother rested. 6 years ago, Maeve had brought flowers here and scattered her grandmother's ashes into this very water. "Grandma, I'm here. I came to see you." Maeve cupped her cheeks in her hands and called out to the ocean. Because Rosa had rejected her, Maeve was raised by her grandmother. Her grandmother had been the closest person in her world, giving her the best education, endless love, even leaving her a large fortune after she passed. Maeve had donated it all to the Hope Project in her grandmother's name. People called her unreasonable. They said she was putting on a show, but Maeve hated it when others sought gain without effort. That wealth didn't feel like hers. She first saw Noah at her grandmother's funeral. He stood in a perfectly pressed black suit and bowed 3 times before her grandmother's portrait. Among his peers, he was the strongest, the most outstanding, and yet her impression of him stayed fixed there because afterward they never crossed paths again. Until that drunken night, that accident, and from then on, color drained from her life, leaving only a relentless, aching anticipation. She lowered her head. Tear after tear fell onto the back of her hand. Useless, that's how she felt. When her grandmother was alive, she'd said, "You're a delicate girl, you don't need to pretend to be strong." Back then, there had been an embrace to fall into. Now, with no one left, she could only hold herself up. "Young lady, why are you still sitting here? The sea breeze is strong at night. It's dangerous." A flashlight beam wavered over the rocks. The old night watchman from Seaside Park stood there, concerned. Maeve wiped her face quickly, slipped off her red heels, and picked her way down the reef, careful, one step at a time. It was past midnight when she drove up to the villa on the mountain. She slipped inside, bone-tired, hair tousled by the sea wind, her red heels dangling from her fingers. In the dark, the shape on the sofa made her start. Then she remembered, the 8th. No one turned on the lights. Noah sat there, eyes darker than the night, watching her in silence. Maeve didn't speak. After a beat, she walked past him and headed straight for the bedroom, ignoring him completely. A low, mocking laugh followed. He crushed the cigarette at his fingertips, rose, and walked after her. When he pushed open the door, he found Maeve by the window. The room was pitch black. Outside, mottled light bled through and fell across her pale face, washing her in a quiet, inexplicable desolation. He forced himself to stop, to not claim her. If they kept going, it would only end in damage he could never forgive himself for. How could he let her get hurt? The moment Noah stepped away, Maeve felt hollowed out. She curled into a ball and stared at nothing. From the bathroom came the rush of water, then the rustle of clothes, then the hard slam of the door. He left. Maeve sat alone, eyes vacant, looking out the window. Darkness swallowed the city. This night was very dark and very long. Noah guided the Range Rover along the silent mountain road. The midnight station was playing that old song, Cinderella. A beautiful melody. Tonight it scraped at his nerves. He shut off the radio and raked a hand through his hair, irritated. It wasn't the 8th, not a special day. He just missed her, wanted to hold her, to be with her, and never imagined it would end like this. He'd stood under cold water to kill the heat in his blood, then fled. He couldn't risk hurting her again. He never thought he'd be the one to worry like this. When the nanny opened the door, Angie was on the sofa watching TV. "Noah, I was just thinking about you, and you show up. Does that mean we're of one mind?" She smiled and threw herself into his arms. He pushed her away, cold as ice. "Angie, where did you go today? What did you do?" His voice dropped deep and hard. Angie panicked, then pasted on innocence. "What else could I do? I went shopping with a few colleagues. I even bought you an Armani suit." She turned to the nanny. "Nana, bring the suit I bought for Noah." "Yes, miss." Nana came down with a beautifully wrapped box. Angie slipped a hand around Noah's arm, sweet as syrup. "Try it on for me, will you? I don't know if it fits." Noah pushed the jacket aside. His gaze was heavy, frigid. "Anne, drop the act. It only disgusts people. Did you go to Maeve's hospital today?" "No, I don't even know which hospital she's in." She said it fast, too fast, and guilt flickered across her face. He caught her chin between 2 fingers, a chill rolling off him. Her beautiful face was full of lies. If it wasn't you, how would she know about basketball, guitar, Cinderella, and forehand duets? Does she know about prophecies too? Angie turned her face away, eyes skittering. She didn't dare meet his gaze. "If she doesn't even know those things, she isn't worthy to be your wife," she mocked. "She doesn't need to know them." The temperature in Noah's eyes fell to ice. The past he'd shared with Angie had been left behind long ago. Noah was a rational man. After ending things with Angie, he gave Maeve a new start, a grand wedding, a home that was theirs, a heart scrubbed clean, and a lifetime promise. But she already knows our past, Angie growled, breath quickening. Noah looked at her and sneered. She isn't as bored as you. Angie flinched, then snapped back, stubborn. I don't know what you're talking about. His eyes went colder still. Get this straight and let go. A month ago, you hired a private investigator to look into Maeve. Because you didn't hurt her, I turned a blind eye. That doesn't mean I'll indulge you. Angie couldn't deny it. She lifted her chin. Yes, I did. So what? I want you back, Noah. You were mine. Ange, when will you understand I don't belong to you, and Maeve is my wife? His face set, voice like stone. Her clear eyes went unfocused. She clutched her head and screamed, hysterical. You're mine, you're mine. No one can take you away. Her frenzy tightened his chest. He stepped in and held her. Hey, calm down. Noah is mine, mine. She kept repeating it, voice breaking into a wail. Angie, calm down. He sat with her on the sofa and let her lean against his chest. Her hands were ice on his arm. She trembled and stared, unfocused. Noah is mine. You're mine, right? Her voice climbed, agitation rising. Yes, I'm yours. He said it to soothe her, against his heart. She clung to him, fierce. You're mine. Noah belongs to Angie. After her medication, Angie finally quieted and drifted into sleep. Exhausted, Noah picked up his jacket and headed for the door just as it opened. Mrs. Lopez had returned. Audrey Lopez, the internationally renowned soprano who had once been a force at home and abroad. You're late. It's not safe to drive. Stay here tonight. Audrey's smile was warm as she handed her leather bag to the nanny. No, Angie's asleep already. I should go back now. Noah had already changed his shoes in the foyer. Audrey understood. Angie must have had another episode. No wonder Noah looked torn. Caring for someone with schizophrenia and severe depression was a brutal road. Noah, I know you've worked hard these 3 years, but Angie is a patient. Whatever she does wrong, I hope you can forgive her. Auntie, whatever Angie does to me, I can bear it. I owe her. But Maeve owes her nothing. If Maeve is harmed in the slightest, I won't keep forgiving anyone. His tone stayed calm, but the cold that rolled off him made Audrey's skin prickle, with a faint edge of threat beneath. Audrey trembled without meaning to. She knew in her heart she couldn't cross his bottom line. If Noah wanted to destroy someone, no one would escape. Leaving the Lopez family residence, Noah drove back to the mountain villa. The car wound up the dark road, slipped through the gates, and rolled to a stop out front. A soft click, then the lighter flared, a brief bloom of fire in the pitch-black cabin, then darkness again. He lit a cigarette. In the quiet, the ember at his fingertips and the curl of smoke felt stark, almost loud. He leaned back, exhausted, and tipped his head to the window, staring at the dim yellow light burning in the villa's bedroom. Warmth, the kind he'd longed for far too long. The bedroom light stayed on the entire night. He knew Maeve couldn't sleep either. Two hedgehogs, he thought, aching to hold each other, unable to do anything but brace against the quills. By the time Maeve stepped out to head to work, Noah had already driven away. He didn't need her to know he'd waited outside all night. He didn't want to burden her. Maeve spent the entire day in surgery. The last operation ran until 1 in the morning. An older mother delivered a healthy baby girl. As Maeve stepped out of the operating room, still in her blue sterile gown, the night shift nurse hurried over and placed a phone in her hand. Dr. Foster, your phone has been ringing the whole time. Thank you. Maeve glanced at the call log. Dozens of missed calls from Noah. She called back. The line connected quickly. What's the matter? Did Angie go to you today? She's missing. Anxiety bled through Noah's voice, tight and low. No, I'll let you know if I see her. She hung up, cold, clipped. Bone-tired, Maeve took the chart and started down the long corridor toward her office. At this hour, the hospital was deserted. The corridor felt wider, emptier. Under the harsh white lights stood a woman in a white coat. At a glance, she looked like a ghost, arms wrapped around herself, shivering. No telling how long she'd been there. Maeve stopped, brows knitting. She lifted her phone and dialed. Noah, Angie is at the hospital. Come over. Before she could finish, Angie lunged. The phone clattered to the floor. Angie seized Maeve's arm, nails digging in, her voice breaking into a ragged, hysterical plea. What will it take for you to let go of Noah? I'm sorry, I don't know what you're talking about. Maeve kept her voice steady. She tried to push Angie away, but the woman's grip only tightened, nails biting her wrist. Stop pretending, Maeve. Name your conditions. Do you want money? Give me a price. However much, whatever you want, I'll agree. Maeve fell silent. How could money measure what she felt? A heavy sadness pressed down, and for a moment she thought she'd crumble. She never imagined everything between her and Noah would be reduced to a price. Angie sobbed, words spilling. I've been with Noah since I was 18. He's the first man I ever loved, and we love each other with everything. Maeve went still. Her chin lifted slightly, a bitter, breathless laugh slipping out. A single cold tear slid to the corner of her eye. The taste of bitterness touched her lips. In that instant, she felt like the intruder, the third person standing between them. The elevator at the end of the corridor dinged open. Noah rushed out, eyes only on Angie. He didn't even glance at Maeve. He crouched and gathered Angie up. She threw herself into his arms and cried harder, her face ashen, wounded. Noah, I can't lose you. Without you, I'll die. I really will. I'm here. Don't be afraid. I won't leave you. His voice softened, soothing. Maeve knew then she had lost completely. She watched as Noah walked away with another woman in his arms. The faint light of hope in her eyes went dark. He said he would explain later, but she didn't think it was necessary. She leaned back against the snow-white wall. Strength fled her limbs. Slowly, she slid down to the corner and sat. She closed her eyes. Darkness rose up and wrapped around her as something inside her cracked, loud as breaking glass. This time, she truly despaired of him. Tears slipped down her cheeks. She pressed a hand to her lips to keep the sound in, folded forward, forehead to her knees, her body trembling. Even her crying had to be quiet, endured. Her phone buzzed on the floor. Noah's name pulsed on the screen. She answered. His voice was calm, magnetic as always. Maeve, are you all right? Angie, did she hurt you? The calm covered worry. And something like love? I'm fine. Don't worry. She gave a small, foolish smile and hung up. She looked down at her arm. Angry crescents marred her skin. Angie's handiwork. Maeve walked home in the dark. She started to pack. In the end, she filled only a small suitcase, so little for a place called home. On the dressing table, expensive jewelry gleamed. Every season, Noah had people deliver the latest pieces. She was only ever responsible for hanging them, one by one, in the wardrobe. She never wore them. She hadn't even cut the tags. In the 3 years they'd been married, she had never taken a penny of his. She refused to be a vine wrapped around a tree. But Noah was a domineering man. He wanted women to treat him as their heaven. She sat on the soft bed, palms skimming the snow-white sheet, her mind empty. 3 years of marriage, and so few memories worth keeping. She smiled wryly, shook her head, set the key on the tea table. Then she picked up her suitcase and headed for the door. From start to finish, Noah had never loved her. What was the point of forcing a man who didn't love her to stay by her side? Let it end like this. Before she could step out of the villa, Noah returned. His gaze cut straight to the luggage in her hand, and he understood instantly. "Where to?" he asked. Maeve looked at him and gave a small, flat laugh. Her voice was steady, surprisingly steady, but her knuckles were bloodless on the suitcase handle. "Noah, let's get divorced." Noah said nothing. He shrugged off his jacket onto the sofa, sat down with practiced grace, crossed his legs. A cigarette flared between his fingers. He took a slow drag, then exhaled. "I didn't hear you clearly. What did you say? Say it again." His calm set her on edge. But what could saying it twice change? How could she go on with a marriage so full of holes? Her lips trembled. She bit down to steady them. "I said, we divorce." "Divorce?" He smiled, cold as ice. His eyes were colder still. The hand hidden at his side clenched so hard his slender fingers blanched. It took everything in him not to let his real emotions show. He had sped back, mind racing with how to explain. He'd even thought of telling her everything. And when he rushed in, breathless with urgency, she handed him one word: divorce. "Divorce? Don't even think about it." "Maeve Foster," he said softly, dangerously, "how dare you toss out the word divorce so easily? Is our marriage a game you get to call off whenever you like?" He ground the cigarette into the ashtray hard, like a vent he refused to give voice to. Maeve could almost hear the sizzle. Even without the sound, she felt the storm in him, the anger, the frost. She knew how dangerous and angry Noah Anderson could be, but better to be shattered now than keep living like a zombie. The corner of her mouth tilted in a bleak smile. Her clear eyes misted over. "Is it because our beginning was so wrong that we were doomed to never find happiness? Noah, I really did my best. I tried to be a good wife. I tried my best to love you. I was good to you, but the night is so dark. I'm really scared alone. Noah, if there's even a trace of pity in you for me, please, let me go." She almost begged, tears streaking down her cheeks. He looked at her, stunned. Maeve had never shown him this kind of raw, fragile heart. He had missed it all along. Maeve needed care too. "Maeve," he murmured, voice low and rough. He rose, drew her into his arms, and kissed her, hungry, frantic, trying to soothe her fear and, without meaning to, pressing against her wound. "Let go, it hurts." Maeve turned her face away, pushing at his chest. Her tears spilled harder, sliding over her lips. The bitterness soaked straight into her heart. He frowned and let her go. Then, ignoring her flinch, he caught her wrist and tugged up her sleeve. Thin rivulets of blood still seeped from the untreated cuts. "Angie hurt you?" Maeve turned her face aside, saying nothing, agreement in her silence. Something softened in Noah's eyes. He took her hand and brushed a cool kiss over her knuckles. "Maeve, about Angie, I can explain." "No, I don't want to hear anything." She clapped both hands over her ears and backed away, step after step, until her shoulders hit the hard wall. She didn't want another word of their story. If she'd known Angie lived in his heart, she would never have married him. Please let it not be too late to stop now. Noah watched her, expression weighted, then nodded once. "All right, I won't say anything. Maeve, let's talk another day." He sat back on the sofa, lifted the day's newspaper, and began to read. The room fell into silence as if just moments ago she'd been throwing a childish tantrum. Maeve let out a bitter laugh and tightened her grip on the luggage. "Noah, I'm not negotiating with you. I'm telling you my decision." At that, Noah lowered the paper. His handsome face was composed as ever. His eyes were dark, unreadable. "What exactly do you want me to do? Maeve, do you truly think divorce is the only solution?" "I just want you to let me go." Her voice shook, but her resolve did not. Silence again, thick enough to choke on. After a long moment, Noah stood and walked to her with a gentleman's poise. He did nothing, only lowered his head slightly to look into her face. "If this is what you want, fine. I'll grant your wish." He turned and slammed the door behind him. The crack of it made Maeve's heart jolt. She stood there, stunned, the handle burning hot in her palm. She couldn't move, couldn't leave, couldn't stay. She had no idea what to make of Noah's exit or what it meant. The urgent ringtone split the silence of the room. She glanced at the caller ID. Noah. Noah. The other end stayed quiet, only the faint sound of breathing. Maeve sighed. Noah, about the divorce? He cut in, calm, low, magnetic. Maeve, I married you because I meant to spend my life with you. I, Noah Anderson, have never treated marriage like a game. It was the first time those words had ever left his mouth, and pretending she wasn't moved would be a lie. Maeve bit her lip as tears slid free. His words were beautiful, but now, what good were they? Noah, let's part ways. All right, Maeve. If I die, you'll be free. His voice collided with the screech of brakes, then a crash, then the line filled with a flat, stuttering beep. Noah? Noah. Panic rose sharp in her throat as she shouted into the phone, but only the busy tone answered. She ran, no coat, no plan, up the mountain road until she saw it. Noah's Land Rover crumpled against a low stone foundation. The front end was mangled, metal torn like paper. In the driver's seat, Noah hung slack in the harness. Blood masked his face until his features disappeared beneath it. Maeve grabbed the door handle and yanked, locked from the inside. He'd left himself no room to retreat. The gas tank was torn. Gasoline dripped across the floorboards, the fumes sharp and choking. One spark and... odd. She snatched a rock and smashed it into the window. The glass spiderwebbed, then burst. She reached in, found the lock, and popped it. Her arms slid under Noah's weight. She dragged, tugged, every breath a grunt, hauling him out of the seat and down to the shoulder. Twice she fell. Her knees and forearms split open on gravel. She didn't feel the pain. Noah, Noah, wake up. Don't scare me. Her hands pressed hard on his chest. She tilted his head, sealed her mouth over his. Breath in and again. He didn't stir. She repeated it, mechanical, relentless. Press, press, breath. Tears ran over her lips and into his mouth. She tasted salt and didn't taste it at all. Open your eyes. Look at me. We're not getting a divorce. Even if we torture each other for the rest of our lives, I won't leave you. She shook him, voice cracking. Her heart had already fallen to the bottom of a valley. Regret surged, hot and savage. If she'd known this was the outcome, she would never have said those two words. 3 years. After all they'd weathered, how could this be the end? Noah, don't die. Please don't die. She pressed her face to his chest, terrified he'd slip into sleep and never come back. The ambulance finally roared in. Maeve sprawled across Noah, sobbing. Miss, please step aside. A nurse tugged her back. Paramedics lifted him onto a stretcher and rushed him into the ambulance. The fire engine's siren howled, rattling her bones as they sped away. An oxygen mask covered Noah's face. The monitor numbers jerked and danced, unstable, uncertain. Maeve sat by his side, clinging to his hand, her eyes fixed on him and nowhere else. Only outside the operating room did they pry their fingers apart. She sank onto a bench, staring up at the surgical light. Her vision blurred. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand until the room cleared, but the light above the door still burned. Footsteps pounded down the corridor. Butch and Eva Anderson hurried toward her. General Anderson was still in his immaculate uniform. It was clear he'd come straight from the base. Eva reached her first and, without a word, slapped her. The sting bloomed across Maeve's cheek. She bit down on her lip as tears flooded her eyes, saying nothing. Eva, what are you doing? Butch grabbed his wife's arm. His face was tight and drawn. Everyone in the Anderson family knew they doted on their third-born most. Ask her, was I wrong to slap her? Noah is my son. I know his nature. Eva's hand trembled, evidence of how hard she'd struck. I'm sorry, Dad. Mom. I'm sorry. It's all my fault. Maeve's voice broke, her swollen face wet with tears. She blamed herself for everything. Now is not the time for this. How is Noah? Butch asked. Maeve shook her head. She didn't know. After 5 endless hours, the surgical light finally went dark. The doctor stepped out and pulled down his sterile blue mask. Doctor, how is my son? Eva asked, breathless. He's out of danger. We'll transfer him to a room after 24 hours of observation. Thank God. Noah's all right. Eva pressed a hand to her heart. Her eyes shone wetly. They observed him in the ward for 2 days and found no new complications. Maeve hardly moved from his side. She didn't seem to sleep. She didn't seem to eat. Noah lay quiet against the sheets. Tube lines traced pale paths to his arms. Cold machines hummed. Numbers flickered on a monitor steady enough to promise time. Maeve curled forward, face buried in her palms, her tears cooling as they fell. She had thought, foolishly, that if she let him and Angie be together, he'd be happy. She didn't understand how they'd come to this. The more she tried to grasp his heart, the further it seemed to drift, and she was left more confused than ever.
The heroine is currently facing a difficult situation and needs your support. Please leave your words of encouragement for her in the comments section.
The door banged open. Dina strode in, grabbed Maeve's arm, and hauled her up. Let go, it hurts. Maeve's brows pinched tight. Cuts and bruises crisscrossed her skin, some scabbed, some still seeping from the night she saved him. You still know pain? You sit here day and night watching that man, but you won't even treat your own wounds. If they get infected, if it turns to tetanus, your little life will be gone. Maeve gave a careless laugh. What a fuss over a small injury. Don't stare at that man like he's going to vanish. He won't die. You come with me. Now. Dina ignored her resistance and dragged her to the infirmary. Not long after they left, Angie arrived at the hospital. Noah lay flat on the bed, eyes glazed at the ceiling. He'd just woken. Everything felt blurred at the edges. His last clear memory was the crash. You're awake, aren't you? Do you know how worried I've been? Angie took his hand, tears pooling in her eyes. It's you. He had thought the first face he'd see would be Maeve's. Disappointment pricked, so she'd really decided to leave him, not even caring if he lived or died. Where's Maeve? Noah asked, voice rough. Angie flinched, then shook her head. I don't know. When I came in, I only saw Aunt. His lashes trembled. I'm fine. You should go back. The hospital isn't a good place. No, I'm not leaving. She pulled a chair close, sat by the bed, took his hand again, and rested her head against his chest. Noah, it doesn't matter if she doesn't want you anymore. We can still be together. A sudden throb tore through his chest, deeper than any ache in his body, so sharp he could barely breathe. So this was heart-piercing pain. Who would have thought that the third young master of the Andersons, who always called the shots, would be the one abandoned by a woman? Maeve hurried back from the infirmary, bandaged in haste. Through the half-closed door she froze. Angie was curled against Noah's chest, sobbing. Noah, it's my fault. I won't force you anymore. She's the governor's daughter. I know that puts you in a hard spot. I'm sorry I was too greedy. We can be together like this. I won't ask for a name. Noah answered, low and hoarse, too soft for Maeve to catch. Comforting words, no doubt, words she didn't want to hear. Her fingers slipped from the doorknob. Like a deserter, she darted into the corner of the corridor, pressing her back to the cold wall. Pain burned behind her eyes. For days she hadn't left his side. She barely dared to blink, terrified he'd be gone in the next breath. And what had she been waiting for? To see him and Angie wrapped up in each other? To feel her own heart crack? From start to finish, the person in his heart wasn't her. He refused to divorce, hiding behind the fact that she had a governor for a father. Inside, Noah finally managed to send Angie away. He lay back, staring at the drip bag swaying above. Memories rose like tidewater. He'd met Maeve at his lowest, when the woman he loved had abandoned him, when his career had nosedived, when his uncle and cousin made it hell at the company and tried to force him out. It was the darkest stretch of his life. And then he saw her, the dawn in it. Their first meeting had been at her grandmother's funeral. She wore pure black, her skin white as snow. People whispered she was cold by nature, she hadn't shed a single tear. He kept his opinions to himself. They weren't close, hadn't even exchanged a word. But by chance he found her alone on the rooftop, crying where no one could see, silent, desperate, trying to swallow grief that had nowhere to go. She noticed him. Panic flashed across her pale face. When their gazes met, her tear-washed eyes were shockingly bright. Noah didn't believe in love at first sight. Not then. Yet in that moment, he would have given anything to wipe the sadness from her eyes. Later, despite his parents' objections, he married her, even transferred all his assets into her name. He loved her so much, and lately she wouldn't even spare him a glance. His heart sank, colder and heavier. Like a stubborn child, he tore out the 4 and yanked at the wires. The alarm light above blinked, insistent. Out in the corridor, Maeve saw doctors and nurses rush into Noah's room. Panic seized her. Had his condition worsened? She took a step toward the door, then stopped dead. If she went in now, she'd only make it worse. And he probably didn't want to see her at all. Eva arrived at the hospital the moment she heard he was awake and found chaos. She seized Maeve by the hair, fury snapping in her voice. "If anything happens to Noah, I won't let your family off." Inside, Noah thrashed like a wounded beast, fighting hands and restraints. "Get out, all of you. I don't need your treatment." "Noah, don't be like this." Eva threw herself against the bed, sobbing. "If something happens to you, how's Mommy supposed to live?" She'd birthed him with her own flesh. This son was the piece of her heart she could never bear to lose. By then, the doctors and nurses had him pinned to the bed. They'd already pushed a tranquilizer into his vein, yet he still fought, weak, stubborn, refusing to cooperate. "Get out. I don't want to see you." Veins stood out on his forehead. Eva was slick with cold sweat. She stroked his brow, pained. "Noah, stop torturing yourself. Tell Mom, what do you want, so you'll cooperate with the treatment?" "I want to see Maeve." "All right. As long as you work with the doctors, I'll bring her in right away." Eva wiped her tears, stood, and stepped out. The doctor finished the examination, hung the 4, and the team filed out one by one. Maeve walked in, head lowered, stopping at the door. The last nurse packed her kit and paused beside Maeve. "Dr. Foster, you haven't rested in days. You can't keep going like this. Your husband's awake now. Please take a little time to rest." Thank you." Maeve managed a small smile and watched the nurse leave. When she turned back, Noah was watching her, quiet, deep-eyed, unreadable. "You're awake," she murmured, lips pressed thin. Noah's smile was polite, elegant. The nurse's words and Maeve's pale face, the bloodshot eyes, oddly they eased something in him. Still, "You're awake" was a stingy greeting. "Come here." He lifted an arm, inviting. Maeve moved to the bedside and sat. Head bowed, silent. She didn't know how to face him. Not now. "If I stop refusing treatment," he asked softly, "do you plan to never see me again?" His tone stayed calm, but the worry threaded through it was there for anyone willing to hear. Maeve, muddled as she was, couldn't. She shook her head without looking up. "He has Angie. He doesn't need me." "I'll help you and Angie. Isn't that good enough? Why not just divorce? If you're worried about my dad." "Maeve," his eyes chilled. If I told you I love you, would you believe me? She stared, shocked, then the surprise drained away. The image of Angie pressed close to him still burned behind her eyes. Believe it? Love, the word sounded like a cruel joke. Zawa, don't joke. When you're discharged, we can file the divorce papers. I'll explain everything to my dad so you don't have to make things hard on yourself. He looked at her, cold and unfamiliar, anger flickering at the edges, so his feelings were a joke to her. Go out. He turned away, the words clipped and frigid. Maeve's lips parted, but the sound stuck in her throat. She stood there a long moment, then turned, pushed the door open, and slipped out, silent, composed, empty. What for? Trevor Smith frowned, not getting it. Noah's mouth curved, but not with humor. Don't tell me you didn't know the governor flies to London for meetings next week. Why is the news so quiet? Trevor hesitated. Aunt already knows Maeve wants to divorce you. If you leave now, she'll pressure the Foster family. Noah leaned back against the pillows and said nothing. Trevor understood Noah was letting his mother teach Maeve a lesson. This is good, too. You've been too lenient with her. A woman can't be too pampered. You talk too much. Are you that free? Noah cut in, voice icy. Trevor shrugged, then stood. All right, rest. This lowly one will handle your errands. When Maeve learned Noah had begun discharge procedures, she hurried back to his room. Injuries need 100 days, yet after barely half a month, he wanted out. She pushed the door open. He stood at the window, hands clasped behind his back. At the sound, he turned his head. Sunlight poured in behind him, gilding the sharp line of his cheek. In that moment, he looked unbearably handsome. Maeve froze, caught off guard. He walked to her and stopped close. His height blocked the light over her head, pressing down on her like a shadow. Am I good-looking? The corner of his mouth held a wicked curl. Maeve bit her lower lip, lifted her chin, and glared. Who allowed you to leave the hospital? Noah said nothing, just studied her. What was that in her voice, anger or concern? His gaze, sharp, unblinking, made Maeve's skin prickle. She turned her face aside, biting down harder. You can't leave the hospital, she repeated. I'm going to London. 11 o'clock flight, he said, calm as ever. Maeve went still, brows drawing tight. Leaving now? Was he trying to avoid her? Noah checked his watch, then looked up gently. I have to go. Wait for me to come back. Maeve lowered her head. Maybe, when he returned, they could talk about the divorce. While the thought flickered, his warm palm lifted her chin. He smiled warm, yes, but danger flickered in his eyes. Maeve, don't ignore my words. If you want to leave me, that's only if I'm dead. He leaned down and brushed her lips, light, brief, then let her go, opened the door, and left. In the wide white room, Maeve stood where he'd left her, stunned and utterly still.